from Spain by a treaty called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and it became a territory of the United States. At that time, they changed the name of the fort from the Spanish name of Castillo de San Marcos to the name Fort Marion in honor of Francis Marion, who was the swamp fox of the American Revolution. And the reason that they didn't change it to Fort St. Mark's was that there was already a Fort St. Mark's in the American system, and that would be what Castillo de San Marcos would translate to. So this is a story about that includes the early story of Fort Marion as well as the story of the national parks. It all started out west, our national parks. And I start our story in the winter of 1808 and 1809 with John Colter. He had been a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition that went out to explore the Louisiana Purchase after Thomas Jefferson commissioned Lewis and Clark to go out there and see if they could find a river that ran all the way to the Pacific, which they didn't find. But after his 2 years with Lewis and Clark, he came back, and he then took a 500-mile walk west into the Rockies by himself in the winter. And he would be the first person of European heritage to ever see the wonders of Yellowstone during that walk. When he got back, he told of this wonderfully marvelous place, a land that he called the land of fire and brimstone. And they laughed at him. They said that this was just Coulter's hell, is the way that they called it. But as time progressed over the next 5 decades, other mountain men and fur trappers would also see Yellowstone. And one of them was Jim Bridger. And Jim Bridger would talk about Yellowstone by saying that it was full of bubbling pools of mud, boiling springs and geysers. And these tales would begin to excite the interest of the American people about this park out there that they called Yellowstone. After the Civil War, there would be several geological expeditions to investigate Yellowstone. In one of them, which was called the Washburn Expedition in 1870, there was a member of that expedition named Cornelius Hedges. He was a reporter for the Helena Daily Herald. And he called it, he said, Yellowstone is as diabolical an appearance as the witches' cauldrons of Macbeth. But he would be the first man to suggest and popularize the proposal of turning Yellowstone into a public park, something that had not been done before. The following year, the Hayden Expedition, a man named Jay Cooke, president of the Northern Pacific Railroad, he was building a railroad across the northern part of the United States from the Great Lakes all the way to the Pacific coast. And he was going to be skirting just north of this region that they were talking about. And he wanted to see what was there because he believed that if he could bring tourists to Yellowstone, he could make a lot of money with his railroad moving west. So he had this expedition started, and Ferdinand Hayden was in charge of it. He had 32 members of the expedition. He was the geologist, but most of them were scientists. There was a botanist, a meteorologist, a zoologist, an ornithologist. I keep having problems with that word, for birds, a mineralogist, an entomologist for insects, two topographers, map makers, a renowned photographer named William Henry Jackson, and an equally renowned artist named Thomas Moran, as well as guides, cooks, waiters, hunters, wagon master, mule team, teamsters, an ambulance, and a physician. So this is a pretty good group. But they came up with a 500-page scientific report that they sent to Congress on the marvels of Yellowstone. Together with that, they had the photography from William Henry Jackson. And it was marvelous, things that they had never seen before back east. The lower basin of the Mammoth Hot Springs, the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, and Old Faithful. And people were beginning to look at this and say, this is something that we have never seen in this country before. And the artist Thomas Moran did some paintings of what he saw when he was on the expedition. And one of them, called Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, is now in the Smithsonian. It is a huge picture. The government paid him $10,000 for it, and it made his career. He'd go back to Yellowstone on several occasions and paint more paintings, and he even changed his name to Thomas Yellowstone Moran. But because of this expedition, in 1871, the 42nd Congress passed a bill that said that it was to set apart a certain tract of land lying near the headwaters of the Yellowstone River as a public park. In March of 1872, President Grant signed that bill, and Yellowstone National Park was created. It would be the first national park in the world. A few years later, in 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed, and it had a spur leading into Yellowstone, where the railroad built the Old Faithful Inn for visitors to come to Yellowstone, and it would become the #1 tourist attraction in the West and make a lot of money for the Western Pacific Railroad. Today's Yellowstone is just a picture of marvels, things that aren't shown or that you cannot see anyplace else. If you haven't gone to Yellowstone, it should certainly be on your bucket list. Also, that same year that the Western Pacific Railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad was completed, President Chester Arthur came to Florida, and he came to this fort, Fort Marion. He saw this fort, and he saw the dilapidated condition that this fort was in. And he went back to Washington, and he requested Congress to appropriate $5,000 in historic preservation for Fort Marion. That year, Congress did, in 1874. They appropriated $5,000 for historic preservation for this fort, and this would be the first time in American history that Congress enacted any legislation to appropriate historic preservation funds, and it came for this fort. Returning to the West, the next part of our saga begins with Big Jim Savage. He was the major in charge of the Mariposa Battalion, and they fought the Mariposa War out in California. He and his battalion chased some Indians into a valley that they said was the most beautiful valley they had ever seen. One of the men along on the expedition with him was a doctor named Lafayette Bunnell. He would write a book calling it Discovery of the Yosemite in 1851. And he would be the man that would name this valley Yosemite Valley. You can still get this book today on Amazon if you'd like to read it. The original book about the first white men to go into Yosemite. A decade later, Galen Clark would become known as the guardian of Yosemite because we have the loggers moving in and felling the great sequoia trees. He and another group of concerned citizens from California went to their congressman, Senator John Conness, and told him they needed to protect Yosemite the way that Yellowstone would be protected later. But the first thing that happened was it would become a grant. Congress passed a bill in 1864 signed by President Lincoln to make Yellowstone a grant. It's not a park, but a grant. To protect Yellowstone and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias for public use, resort, and recreation to be left inalienable for all time. This was the first time in world history that land was set aside for conservation and public use by government action. However, the government left the administration of the park to the state of California, and this would lead to problems later on. An artist also came out to Yellowstone to do portraits to excite the interest of the American people. His name was Albert Bierstadt, and he did some beautiful portraits of Yellowstone. The dome that domes the Yellowstone Bridal Veil Falls, and his masterpiece, which was called Looking Down Yosemite Valley. And this would excite the interest of the American people to go west to California. Then the most famous advocate for protecting the wilderness is the next person to arrive on the scene. His name was John Muir. John Muir was a Scottish immigrant. He came to the United States when he was 11 years old, and his family moved to Wisconsin. His father was a strict Calvinist, and John Muir was raised on church-going and Bible memorization. But the religion that he would find would not be in a church. In 1867, he walked from Indianapolis, Indiana, to Florida, and he wrote a book that was called The 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. It showed what great insight he had into the geology and the botany of the time. 2 years later, he would walk into Yosemite Valley in California, and he wrote that it is by far the grandest of all the special temples of nature which I was ever permitted to enter. He would use religious words in describing Yosemite. It was so moving for him. He talked about lowering up the Yosemite Falls and the Yosemite Valley and Hetch Hetchy Valley. He saw these places and they were absolutely beautiful, and he would write on his journal. He kept journal entries on a daily basis. In fact, at the time that Muir went there, the prevailing view was that Yosemite Valley was formed when the mountains actually collapsed. They didn't think about the fact that there were glaciers at the time. It would be John Muir in 1871 that would write an article for the New York Tribune called Yosemite Glaciers. And he is the first man to hypothesize that it was glacial activity that formed Yosemite Valley. And he would write out by saying, take a look into the grand geological library of the park and see how God writes history. He would become the first preservationist in America. As the 1870s progressed, however, he did not like what he was seeing. Commercialism was moving into Yosemite Valley. They built a hotel called the Wawona Hotel, which is still there today. And in 1881, they cut a hole through one of the sequoia trees called the Wawona Sequoia Tunnel Tree, which became a tourist attraction. Also, Muir saw that sheep ranchers were grazing the meadows and turning the meadows into barren wastes. And the loggers were back, and they were cutting down the giant sequoias, and lumber became a big business out there. He was then approached by Robert Underwood Johnson, the owner and editor of the Century magazine, a progressive magazine of the era. And he came to Muir and wanted to team up with him to save Yellowstone. So together that he would write articles that would be published in the Century, and Underwood Johnson would then lobby Congress to declare Yellowstone a national park. They were successful, and it became a national park in 1890 with some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. Bridal Veil Falls, Lower Yosemite Falls, Half Dome at sunset. If you've ever been to Yosemite or go to Yosemite, go down into the valley at sunset as the sun is going over the mountain edges. And the only thing that's sticking up that the sun hits is Half Dome. And it lights up in gold. It is absolutely remarkable to see. And in order to protect Yosemite, they sent in buffalo soldiers. These were the black soldiers that went out west after the American Civil War to fight the Indians. And they would become basically the first park rangers out in Yosemite. Their job was to patrol the backcountry, fend off the poachers, stop the illegal timber loggers, and stop the livestock grazers. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt visited those national parks. He went to Yellowstone for 2 weeks with naturalist John Burroughs, and he camped out in Yellowstone. And then went from there to Yosemite Valley, where he met with John Muir. This is a picture of Roosevelt with John Muir in front of one of the big Mariposa Grove trees. And they would go out and camp together by themselves for 3 nights while he was there. And Roosevelt would say, who would be the greatest conservationist president of our lifetime, or any lifetime, he would write in his autobiography about that trip and say that the first night was clear, it's beautiful in color and symmetry, rose around us like the pillars of a mightier cathedral than was ever conceived by the fervor of the Middle Ages. The second night we camped in a snowstorm on the edge of the canyon wall, under the spreading limbs of a grove of a mighty silver fir. The next day we went down into the wonderland of the valley itself. I shall always be glad that I was in Yosemite with John Muir and in Yellowstone with John Burroughs. He would set aside 230 million acres for public land during his administration as president, including 150 million acres as national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, which are today federal wildlife refuges. He created 5 national parks and 18 national monuments, and they would include Crater Lake National Park in Oregon, Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, Devil's Tower, if you remember the movie Close Encounters of a Third Kind, Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming, Muir Woods in California, named after John Muir, another sequoia grove, and the Grand Canyon. In 1905, he created the United States Forest Service, and he named Gilbert Pinchot his first head of the Forest Service. Mr. Pinchot was the foremost forester in the country. He had actually gone to France and studied forestry, got an advanced degree after he graduated from Yale, and came back to the United States as a conservationist. Now, conservationist believes in the intelligent, sustainable use and management of natural resources. As I told you earlier, John Muir was the first preservationist, and there's a distinction between the two. The contrast is that a preservationist believes in maintaining in their present condition areas that are untouched by humans. In other words, the conservationist wants to use the land but preserve it and use it intelligently and scientifically so that it is good for the future generations. The preservationist doesn't want it touched at all, wants to leave it just a vacant, barren wilderness. And this distinction between these two would put them on opposite sides in one of the great environmental disputes of American history. It all started with the great earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco. The earthquake ruptured the gas lines of the city and set the city on fire. And it would burn for days because San Francisco did not have the high pressure water capacity needed to fight the fire. It would burn down most of the city that wasn't destroyed by the earthquake. Gilbert Pinchot believed that this should never be allowed to happen again. And studies after the earthquake determined that the best option for providing San Francisco with water would be to dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley to build an aqueduct that led water to the city of San Francisco. But the problem was the Hetch Hetchy Valley was in Yosemite National Park. And this set up the classic rivalry between John Muir and Gilbert Pinchot. John Muir was incensed. He called it a great crime. He wrote, "Damn Hetch Hetchy, as well damn for water tanks at the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man." This would put the two of them on either side of the president in the middle, and the president would side with Gilbert Pinchot. But it would take another 8 years, and Roosevelt would leave office, and it would be under President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, that 8 years later that the decision was finally made. And in 1913, Congress approved the Hetch Hetchy Dam and Aqueduct, and President Wilson signed it into law. And a lot of people believe that this led to the early death of John Muir. He had put all of his energy into fighting this dam, and when it was signed into law, he was crushed. This is what Hetch Hetchy Valley looked like before the dam went in, and this is the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir today. This is the O'Shaughnessy Dam at Hetch Hetchy that produces the electricity and water that leads through this aqueduct, supplying the entire San Francisco Bay area with water today. And although John Muir lost the battle for Hetch Hetchy, he ended up actually winning the war. Because since then, national park lands would never again be sacrificed for a major commercial enterprise such as this. There have been attempts to dam the Colorado River in Echo Park and in the Grand Canyon in the 1950s and 60s, and they were defeated. And there have been attempts to drill oil in national parks in Alaska, and that was defeated also. In 1916, Congress created the National Park Service to put all of these different national parks on the same page of the playbook, under the same leadership. And the purpose of the law stated it was to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Today, the National Park Service maintains 58 national parks and 117 national monuments. In addition, they have 419 sites that are administered by the National Park, including national battlefields, national preserves, national seashores, national trails, and national memorials. In all, a total of 85 million acres of land have been set aside for the use of the public and to prevent commercialized building on them as part of the National Park system. Returning to our fort here, Fort Marion, in 1924, this fort was designated a national monument by President Calvin Coolidge. In 1933, the fort was transferred from the War Department to where it is today with the National Park Service. And then in 1942, in honor of our Spanish heritage, Congress authorized the name of the fort to be renamed back to its original Spanish name, the Castillo de San Marcos, which it is today. I'd like to finish with this quote from John Muir. "Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul alike." And that is the goal of the National Park Service, to give its people, the people of the United States, a place to go to get away from the humdrums of everyday life, the busy days in the city, and get out into the wilderness and enjoy the woods again. We would like to thank you for spending your National Parks Week with us, We hope you'll enjoy it, have a wonderful time today at our Castillo, because it's your Castillo too. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful time this evening.
Thank you.